Welcome back to another episode of The Shadows of Jesus, where this year we are going through the Bible book by book from Genesis all the way to Revelation, and we're trying to set you guys up to know what we're about to read, but also wrestling with questions that you might have had from things you've already read. But most importantly, we want to do our best to show you how all of Scripture is about Jesus. It's all pointing to him, and so throughout the Old Testament, we see these shadows of Jesus. In the New Testament, it's going to get really explicit, but for name's sake, we're just going to keep the shadows of Jesus for both new and old. But today, we're going to get into...
going to get into Genesis, looking at the rest of the book. And, we've already heard some really encouraging stories from folks that have been reading along with us. And then, you meet others and you talk about, hey, this is what God was showing me in today's reading. And it's like fitting right in with their life at that point. So we're glad that you guys are reading along with us. And I also thought about, as you read each day, Psalm 119 has this great prayer in it that says, open my eyes that I may behold wondrous things out of your law. And so I want to encourage you guys, as you're reading, take that moment to just breathe and pray that God would open your eyes as you read.
Yeah. So last time we met together, but I did a little podcast without you.
I heard.
Making the change.
Not a fan.
Yeah, no problem. But the last time we were together, we talked about the first part of Genesis. Real briefly, that's 3 episodes of fallenness. Adam and Eve, the flood, Tower of Babel. After chapter 11, there's a really big shift, and it really begins with chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. So why don't you read those verses for us?
Let's take a look. Some people have called this the hinge in the book of Genesis. So this is Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Yeah, so this is a big hinge. We just saw the Tower of Babel, where people were trying to make for themselves a great name. Now God's like, no, I'm the one who does that. Mm-hmm. But he's making some promises to Abraham. He's promising him land. He's promising him blessings. And he's promising him that he's going to have a nation, like that through him, this problem, this brokenness that we've seen just unfold and spiral and progress is going to be somehow fixed through this guy's family. But there's a little problem.
No kids.
Yeah,
they're old and there are no children.
Yeah, he's old and they have no kids. So now at this point, the Bible's going to really zoom in on this one family, Abram, later to be Abraham, his family, which will later be called the nation of Israel. And so the rest of the Old Testament's really zooming in on this nation that's going to come. Yeah. Well, we've got a ton of information. Yeah. And so I've got notes in my hands. I don't think we're going to get through all of the stuff. So we'll pick and choose, do our best. But let's just talk about chapters 12 through 20, and then we'll get into some others. But in chapters 12 through 20, we've got this checkered history between Abraham and the Lord. The covenant's established. Abraham leaves his home behind, and there's 40 to 50 years of just suspense, right? There's so much suspense of like, is God going to come through? Is the promise going to fail? Is it going to be fulfilled? So what are some interesting things from these chapters? Anything when you look at chapters 12 through 20 that you're like, man, Jeff, here's some cool stuff?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that really hits you when you start reading through the Bible and reading through Genesis is if you had like a Sunday school impression of the characters in the Bible that you thought they're either good or they're bad. And then you start reading and you see that they're flawed people, just like us. And so we see that kind of begin to emerge. Abraham, that he lied. To see that about who his wife was. Yeah. So I think those things start to grab my attention.
I think it's so important is if I've asked so many people, hey, as you're reading with us, what are some questions you have? Mm-hmm. A lot of it is simply answered by the literary genre of this is biblical narrative, which records what did happen, not what should have happened. Right. So just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean we're supposed to follow it as an example.
Right. It's descriptive, not prescriptive.
Yeah, so there's a lot of messed up stuff. Yeah, so in chapter 14, one of the things that jumps out is this guy Melchizedek. Had a handful of people ask me, who is this guy? So just doing a brief study. I didn't do a deep dive into this. One, his name means King of Righteousness. That's pretty cool. He's the king of, do you know who he's the king of?
Salem.
Or Salem?
Shalom.
Jerusalem. And so what I read was that Salem is short for Jerusalem. So and obviously that's not the promised land yet. They haven't inherited it, but he's there in Jerusalem. Later kings of Jerusalem are meant to resemble him.
Yeah.
So he's kind of a picture of what kings are to be like. He was a priest of the Most High. So he's a king
and a priest. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jesus comes from his lineage as someone superior. And so what we look at is all priests in the Old Testament come from the tribe of Levi. So like all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. And so, well, if Jesus is the great priest, it's like, well, was he a Levite? No, he comes from Judah.
Yeah.
So how's he a priest? Well, he comes from something that precedes the Levitical priesthood system through Melchizedek.
Yeah. And you see that referenced in Hebrews. You can read where the author of Hebrews talks about that. And I think it's, some people have said, well, is Melchizedek, is he a pre-incarnate Christ? Is this, a theophany? And
what's a theophany, Bill?
When God is like visibly, physically present at some point in time. And so, but I think when you really look at it and think about it, I think that he is a real person. And the author of Hebrews looks at the way that he's described as the king of righteousness and peace, a king that doesn't have a genealogy, but he really did have parents, but that he sees a lot of poetic parallels between Melchizedek and Jesus. And there's also a psalm that references Jesus being in that line.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. Just real quick from Hebrews, it says for Hebrews chapter 7, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High, God met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And the kings that he slaughtered were those bad people that kidnapped his nephew.
Lot
and to him, Abraham apportioned a tenth part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem. That is King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues a priest forever. And so Hebrews picks up on this guy. And so there's obviously probably multiple opinions. If you've seen those 4 perspective books, like I'm sure there's probably 4 perspectives on
Melchizedek.
Probably. Yeah, but that was a question a lot of people had. So I think it's helpful to know that, was he an image of Jesus? Was he a pre-incarnate Christ? Yeah. At the end of the day, Jesus is a better
Melchizedek. Yeah, that's great. And it also is going to highlight this theme of names, where the Hebrews author, he's the king of righteousness and the king of peace. And you see that all through Scripture where names are very significant. We're going to see, in Genesis we saw how Abram, his name has changed, Sarai's name has changed, Jacob's name has changed, and there's a significance in names that we look for.
Yeah, there might be some cool things with names to come today. So chapter 15, there's a big moment in chapter 15 where God sets up a covenant with Abraham. We're going to set up Exodus today, and we'll come back because it shows us that before he inherits all this land, they're going to spend 400 years somewhere. Right. And so, but what's cool about this covenant, I remember when I learned about this in seminary, is the way that covenants were done in this time is you would take an animal, and you would literally slaughter it,
cut it in half,
and divide the pieces. Yeah. Cut it in half. And then you would walk through the bloodied animal and turn around and basically look at that and say, if I break my end of the covenant,
may I be like this animal.
Yeah, may what was done to this animal be done to me. And Abraham doesn't go through. He's sleeping.
Right.
But God goes through on his behalf, which kind of sets us up to know that God's going to take the punishment for our unfaithfulness. So you kind of see this covenant setting up.
Yeah, already
what's going to happen with Jesus.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
That's good. And what else in chapters 12 through 20?
Yeah, let's see.
We got Hagar and Ishmael. I think when I look at that, it seems kind of weird. You're like, why would he, like Sarah's like, here, take my servant. And Abram's like, sounds like a good plan. And from us in our culture, we're going, sounds like a bad plan.
That's what my kids said when we read this. They were like, that's not good.
Yeah, well, one, it's in accordance with the custom of their time. So weird to us, not to them. But I think it shows something about the human heart. It shows that we wrestle with temptation to take matters into our own hands when God's promises seem to be beyond fulfillment. And I think like how true, like, so where the cultural moment of giving your wife away is so foreign to us, or giving your husband to another woman is so foreign to us. Right. The heart issue of taking things into your own hand because you're like, God, are you coming through or not? Like, maybe I need to do this is so real and so relevant to us today.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Anything out of chapter 17?
Let's see. Well, yeah, circumcision. Best moment in Sunday school when you're growing up is when you get to these passages and the teacher reads those things out and then explain, you start talking about that and everybody's snickering. But if you pause and start to think about it, as you think about what's the significance of circumcision, why this mark on all the men of God's chosen people?
Yeah. I think something that stands out to me is it's a picture of something being cut off. So I don't know if you've taken anatomy. I remember in high school, like not knowing what this was. Mm-hmm. And so you cut the foreskin off and it's a picture of something being removed. And once again, like the covenant, like if I break my end of the faithfulness, if I'm not faithful to the covenant, may what was done to this skin being cut off be done to me. And so what we know is like this idea of being cut off from God, that we need not just a physical circumcision, we need a spiritual circumcision. We need a circumcision of the heart, which is only found through Christ, that Jesus was cut off on our behalf so that we could have life. And so I see it as ultimately pointing towards Christ, but those are my thoughts, being cut off and how we need something more than the physical and how Jesus was that way of spiritual circumcision by being cut off on our behalf so that we could be.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, he could have said, well, cut off an earlobe. But he chose a very specific body part that that's tied into the fruitfulness and the multiplication.
That's good.
And the source of this nation that was going to be a blessing to the earth. And so he was marking them to say, hey, I'm marking that the source of this nation. And I think when you even think about the circumcision of the heart, the language in the New Testament, your heart is the source, of life. From it flow the issues of life, and so there's something to that he was very viscerally pointing them to. That this is up to me, and you're committing the source to me.
Yeah, I'm glad we're doing this together. That's great.
Yeah,
listen to what Bill said. Chapters 18 and 19, we get to Sodom getting destroyed. I think this is really cool. They're fairly certain they found the city. So in the location that it would be described, there's a place called Tal El Haman, and they've discovered this. It was wiped out by a blast that would be 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. And they're excavating this thing, and it's like pottery's melted together. Like there's like it's and they're like this is and like we think this is Sodom and Gomorrah. Now there's obviously other explanations of like maybe a meteor hit this place but it looks like fire came from the sky and all these different things. But we look at it and like, that sounds exactly like what God did here. And so that's chapters 12 through 20, chapters 21 through 24, more stuff going on here. The main thing is when we read chapter 12, the kind of the big issue was you're going to have a nation, but you have no children. And the whole time we're like, is he going to have a kid? And I mean, at one point, like Abraham says Sarah's his sister, and she gets brought into another king's harem. And so if she gets pregnant there, like, then there's no Mari to do a DNA test. Like, how do you know that this is Abraham's
So that
son?
Would endanger the promise and the fulfillment of that.
But God thankfully saves that from being an issue. But then we finally get to breathe where a kid's born.
Yes.
It's like,
we get to laugh.
We get to
for Isaac.
Which is great. And so I love that you said there's meaning in names.
Yeah.
What's Isaac's name mean?
Laughter.
And what did Sarah do when God said that she was going to have a kid?
She laughed.
It's almost like every time she calls his name, she's reminded that God gets the last laugh.
That's it.
So
good. That's good.
That's good. Yeah. So, but then all of a sudden, this like relief, like this like, okay, like there's relief here. There's immediate tension because Isaac is the first son of Abraham and Sarah, but he's not Abraham's first son. Right. So there's tension between
Abraham and Ishmael, or Isaac and Ishmael.
Yeah. And so in chapter 21, Isaac's 2 or 3 years old. Ishmael's 15 or 16. And it says he's laughing at Isaac. And that term, that Hebrew word for laughing means to mock or pick on.
Yeah, he's bullying him.
Yeah, he's bullying.
Yeah.
He's bullying his younger brother.
Yeah.
And Sarah's like, that's not okay.
Right.
She gets mad and basically is like,
you got to get this kid out of here.
And then God doesn't stop. God's like, do what she says. You know, so they kick her out. Like, it's like, here, they're just going to die.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's what would have happened. I mean, they're out in the desert and she literally has him, you know, Ishmael here, you know, hang out in these bushes. I'm going to go over here and we're going to die.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden they find a well. And so what's really cool about this, because the Quran records this story as well. But this well is still present today. It's called the Zamzam Well. It's in Mecca. And so what's cool is for Islam, when people make these pilgrimages to Mecca, they reenact the Quran story, which is they run between these two mountains 7 times, and then, which is apparently what Ishmael did, and then underneath his feet drew up a well, and so they honor this well, and they draw water from that well, which is apparently some of the most pure water, period. But we can't ever go to that well because we're not Muslims. But yeah, it's just kind of cool to see like that. Yeah, they've got their flavor on this story. Obviously, they take a different spin on it because they're not following the lineage from Abraham to Isaac, but through Isaac to Ishmael. But to see the historical things like the Sodom being found, the well.
There's this place where this really happened.
This stuff happened. Yeah, these are historical events. This isn't just mythological stuff. Like this, these are real places, real people, real events.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so
now we move on to 22.
Yeah, which is the big thing. Why would God command Abraham
child sacrifice
to sacrifice? And what like this is Abraham's one only son. A question I had: does Abraham think this is his only son? Does he know that Ishmael was saved?
That's a good question.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't like at this point. I wonder if he's like, I only got one son, my other one died, or did Ishmael come home? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you notice too when Abraham tells his servants, he says, "The boy and I, we're going to go and worship the Lord, and then we'll be back." And you're like, so what was Abraham thinking would happen?
Yeah, well, I was talking about just does Abraham know that Ishmael
has another son?
Yeah, that Ishmael didn't die.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, let's fast forward. Let's get past my question. Yeah, so they're going to the mountain to sacrifice. He tells the servants, we, not I, we will be back. Is he lying? Does he believe that they're going to come back? It seems like the author of Hebrews would say that he believed that God was going to
bring. Yeah, like when he would sacrifice, that would mean he was going to kill him and then burn his body, and so he would be ashes. And so he apparently he believed that God would just somehow bring Isaac back from total disintegration.
Yeah.
I mean, that was his faith. He's like, he's the son of promise, and this is what God's going to do. So, I mean, and this is that moment for Abraham where God sees his response, and it's,
Yeah. Another question I had, I don't have an answer for, but when God was about to destroy Sodom, Abraham was like, what if there's a couple righteous people? And he was pleading.
He did. He prayed for them.
Like over and over and over again, like, don't do it. And then he's like, God's like, I want you to kill your son. And he like, why isn't he like, what if he's righteous? Or what if he's like, okay.
Yeah, he's quick.
Yeah, it seems so. Anyways, that just caught me. I'm like, what? But I know, here's what we know. One is that God never intended for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Mm-hmm. So when we think about like, what does it show us of God? The intent was never for that. It was a test.
It was a test.
We read that.
Yeah.
It's God's nature to provide what's required is another thing we see.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite benedictions I've ever heard was the gospel is this: God requires perfection, but what God requires, he has provided in Christ. Mm. And so we see that like God's nature is to provide what is required. So he provides a sacrifice, a substitute.
Yeah.
And then also another thing that we see is in a culture where child sacrifice was normalized, in this moment when God stops it, we see God's hand showing that he does not approve of this type of worship. Mm-hmm. But anything else that stood out for you in that?
I mean, definitely there's so many shadows of Jesus.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that. So just get ready for it because there's so many.
So then 25 through 36. Chapters 25 through 36, we get to Isaac, and he's got 2 sons. He's got Esau, who's like a little Wookiee, little Ewok.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you got Jacob, who's soft-skinned. Mama's boy. And there's all these, like literally like the family, we know that their offspring have to become a nation. Yeah. And the tension between these two, they could wipe each other out and stop the promise in its tracks.
Right there. And if we think about our families and maybe some jacked up relationships that we have and sibling things and parents showing favoritism, and that's all right here. I mean, you really see that jump out in the way that Isaac and Rebekah treat their sons and the drama they're having between them.
So names, what does Jacob's name mean?
Deceiver.
And does he play that out?
Yep.
Exactly. He deceives Esau, and like the way he does it, like he puts on animal skin, which makes me think, how hairy was Esau?
Right. Yeah, like hairy as a goat. That's a hairy dude, man. A lot of testosterone.
And then his mom's helping out. She's cooking food.
Yeah.
Isaac's blind as a bat apparently and can't see anything, and he gets the blessing, and then Esau's ready to kill his brother, and he's like, I won't do it as long as my dad's alive. I don't want to break his heart, but
he's ready.
Yeah, he soothes himself to bed by sharpening his knife, being like, one day I'll kill him.
Yeah,
and I can envision just one day I'm gonna kill my brother and it'll be good.
Right.
Yeah. So in these chapters, there's some cool things that happen though. So one, Jacob flees. He goes across the crescent, whatever it is, and he meets up with Laban and finds his wife. And what I love about this is I've always read Jacob as the pretty boy, like soft skinned, likes to cook, doesn't want to be outside.
But he was really strong.
Dude, he's moving stones that took multiple shepherds to move on his own. We see that he's really skilled and good at
animal husbandry.
Like he's got skill, he's got smarts. But at one point he has this dream.
Yeah.
And he sees a ladder. And on this ladder are angels ascending and descending. And I know we're not supposed to talk about shadows yet, but I love this because you read that, it's really cool that Jesus, when he's talking to a religious leader, says that you will see angels ascending and descending. So when that religious leader who knows Judaism hears that, he's immediately brought back to Jacob's ladder, and he says, not on a ladder, but on the Son of Man, which was his title for himself. And so what does Jacob call this land?
Yeah.
Bethel,
the house of God,
which is the house of God, which the temple. So Jesus, by saying this, is saying, I'm the house of God. I'm the better temple. And so this is ultimately pointing us to Jesus. And
that's good.
Little shadow teaser, if you will.
What about when you see the wrestling, Jacob wrestling with this, person and getting his name changed? What are some of the things that hit you?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I think this is significant, so I don't want to rush through this. So I'll tell you what I think and what I believe, and then if you have any color or another thought, feel free to bring it in. This is a mile marker for my own faith because it was in a crucial moment of my journey that I was reading this story, and I got caught up on the word prevail. I was like, what does it mean that Jacob prevailed against, if he's wrestling God? Is this like me letting my son beat me in a game of basketball so I got like... Like, is this just kind of a jokingly banter? Like, what does it mean he prevailed? And what you realize is, one is he was out deceived by Laban. Like his father-in-law was a better deceiver than he was, and so he's running away from him. And they've kind of made peace. But if you read the Old Testament enough, you realize you can never trust someone's word.
May God watch between you and me is like
And then he gets word that his brother Esau's in front of him. And last time we saw Esau, he was sharpening his knife, ready to kill him.
Yeah.
And so he's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And as we study and we look at Jacob's life, like I said, he was strong, he was smart, he was skilled. But in this moment, he realizes that nothing he brings to the table matters. Like if God doesn't show up, he's not going to make it. So everything he brings to the table means nothing if God's not there. And so when he's saying, I'm not going to let go till you bless me, I think he's saying, God, I'm not going to let go until you show up. Because if you don't show up, I'm not going to make it. And so when it says that he prevailed, I believe the prevailing was he prevailed in that he finally realized that he was fully dependent on God. And so that what he needed most wasn't his strength, but God's strength. Yeah. And so I think the prevailing wasn't him defeating God. I think his prevailing was in that he realized what he needed most, which wasn't what he brought to the table, but what could only be found through God. So that's where I take it. But
yeah, well, as I was reading through it this time, what hit me was how scrappy Jacob is.
Yeah.
And he's sometimes you can have the sense that, well, Christianity and following Jesus is about things being nice and squeaky clean and polished, and you just sunshine and unicorns and that kind of stuff. And this was a guy who, like you said, he wrestled with God, and his new name means you strive with God, and God was, he used that as the name for his people, Israelites, of people who were scrappy in their faith and who had lots of rough edges, but who knew, I've got to have God.
Yeah.
And I think that should be really encouraging. If you don't feel like you're very good at being a religious person, that's okay. But to be scrappy and say, I got to grab hold of God.
Yeah.
Go for it.
And he walked away with what?
A limp.
I think so many of us as God's people, we have limps from our past. Mm-hmm. We've got stories, we've got battle wounds, and it's cool to know like that it's okay to walk with a limp. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's where we need to be, because that limp makes us realize or reminds us of how much we need God.
Yeah. It's very real. Very real.
So a question that I received from multiple people that wasn't even on my radar. So, but I'm like, the fact that multiple people asked this makes me think we've got to talk about it.
Okay.
Dinah, I'm gonna call her name Dinah. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. Mm-hmm. So that's one of Jacob's daughters,
right?
This guy Shechem basically forces himself on her sexually.
Like a neighboring prince of another tribe.
And then his dad's like goes and talks to Jacob and says, give your daughter to mine, and like let's have some more arranged marriages.
Mm-hmm. We'll just merge our tribes together.
The brothers are not cool with it. So they're like, why don't you guys get circumcised? We'll do this. Like, so the guys are like, we're in, we're gonna, and then so they all get circumcised. They're sore. Can't imagine what that's like. And then they go and slaughter them.
Yeah.
And people are like, what's up with that?
What do you think?
I said it wasn't on my radar. I think it's biblical narrative. It's telling us what happened, but I don't think God's smiling upon it.
No.
I don't think God's saying, this is how I think we should have handled it.
Yeah.
I think it's recording what happened, and the fact that Jacob was disgusted by it makes me think like, so I think it's recording for us something that happened, but it's not saying that God approved of that response.
Yeah.
But then I think about like, how would I respond to my sister? So, I know one of the women at Redeemer was like, I want brothers like that.
I'll stand up for you. Yeah. That was, interesting. Well, if we keep rolling through, looking at the back half of Genesis, what are some things that we want to?
Yeah. So chapters 37 through 50, really, we discover how Abraham's family ends up in Egypt, specifically through the story of Joseph.
Yeah, the longest narrative of its type in the Bible.
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Yeah. So something I do want to say is, we talked about that setting Genesis up last week, but an odd piece of these 14 chapters is the story of Judah and Tamar. Mm-hmm. And so more or less, Judah's sons are wicked. I mean, the first one's so wicked, God just takes him out.
Right.
He's like, you don't deserve to live. Like you're going to do more harm. I'm going to save people from your sin.
Yeah.
The next son's not really any better. He's doing some wicked things, but that son, by their custom, took Tamar to be his wife so that his brother could have a son one day. And he's like, well, I don't want to do that. So he's kind of defiling.
God was displeased with that, which I thought about. I was like, that's kind of God wanted them to fulfill that custom.
Yeah.
I can't imagine if my brother died and I had that responsibility to do that, but not our culture.
Yeah, not our culture. And then Tamar, I mean, like she's got no ability to provide for herself. Like she's twice a widower. And then Judah's like, well, I've got one more son, but he's not old enough to be married yet. So just wait until he gets old enough. And so as that son grows up, he's like, well, the last two sons that were married to Tamar died. So like, I don't want him to die. So let's just keep her. So he just keeps her kind of, I would say, oppressed. He keeps her marginalized.
Yeah.
She's disgusted by it. Mm-hmm. And so she basically dresses up like a prostitute, right. Hooks up with her father-in-law. Yeah. He gets her pregnant, and then she goes back home, puts on her widower outfit, and then he finds out she's pregnant. And he's like, she was unfaithful. She should be dead. But she took some things from him, like his signet ring, and
she's like,
and so she's like, well, the man who got me pregnant, these things belong. And he sees him. He's like, that's
Yeah.
That's me.
Yeah.
She's more righteous than I.
Right.
And they have twins. And so it's this scandalous story, but one of the twins' names is Perez.
Uh-huh.
And so what I love about this is Perez fathers Boaz. Mm-hmm. Boaz marries Ruth. Mm-hmm. They have Jesse.
Yeah.
Jesse has David, and it's through the lineage of David that we get Jesus. And then when you read the genealogy in Matthew, whose name pops up?
Tamar.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like God is saying, like, hey, these types of stories, I'm not embarrassed by. Like, these are the type of people I came to save.
Yeah, and they're woven into his redemption.
Like, so your mess, your junk, the baggage of your life that you'd like to hide, God says, I'd like to redeem.
Yeah.
So
that's,
yeah.
and while we're on the topic of Judah, that son, you see other examples of where he's at in his character, and this was one of them. And then you see the way that he treats Joseph. But you want to watch for that as you're finishing up the Genesis, to watch for how Judah changes and ends up saying
multiple sons change.
Yeah.
Right. Like I'll sacrifice my sons. I'll sacrifice. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like God, you see like God's grace.
Yeah. There's a change that happens. And then also there's going to be a prophetic word to Judah that is also one of these things that points us to Jesus.
Yes, that's great. So I mean, so the story of Joseph is great. As you read that and finish up Genesis, there's some cool things there. But it's interesting is lineage is so important since Genesis 3 with the offspring that's going to be the crush the serpent's head. Mm-hmm. We've been meant to follow lineage, and so we find Noah to Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to not Joseph, but Judah. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of interesting that like we're focusing so much on the lineage, but then we go off of someone that's not going to be part of that lineage. Mm-hmm. But it really shows us that there are examples to learn from, and Joseph is biblical narrative, but Joseph is an example to follow, to be faithful to God in all circumstances.
Yeah, incredibly encouraging as you read Joseph and think about that.
Yeah.
And it takes, like, my favorite verse in Genesis might be at the very end where Joseph's brothers, their father dies, and they come to Joseph and they're like, now you're going to kill us.
Yeah.
And he looks at them. He's like, no, you've got it all wrong. And he says that what you meant for evil, God meant for good.
Yeah.
And there's a Brandon Lake song that's out right now that he sings with a guy named Judah, and it's called "Meant for Good," that I love because it just echoes that idea over and over and over again.
Yeah,
it's so good.
Yeah. So one is it gives us an example to follow, but two, it also shows us how God's people end up in Egypt. But let me read chapter 49 real quick, and we'll close with this, and then we'll talk about some shadows.
Yeah.
So in chapter 49. Jacob's blessing his sons, and he says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. So that word lion, from the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness who dares rouse him. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. So he's going to have a kingdom that always lasts, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until the tribute comes to him. To him shall be the obedience of the people. And so this is given to Judah, but it's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. Yeah. So with that, let's talk about some of the shadows of Jesus.
Shadows of Jesus here. What's the first one that?
So I think the replacement. Like this theme of God providing a replacement. So Isaac is about to be sacrificed. Abraham's one and only son.
Right.
As a test to see whether or not Abraham loves God.
Right.
And then when he's about to sacrifice his son, God says, now I know you love me. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus comes and he gives his one and only son and truly sacrifices him, not so that we can show our love for him, but so that he can show his love
for us.
Yeah. And so Jesus is a better ram in the thicket.
Yes. His one and only, and that language when you read in Genesis is your one and only son, and then you look forward to
like John 3:16.
John 3:16. Yeah. We talk about that, and even some of the other imagery of here's the son carrying the wood on his back, up the hill. Oh man,
yes.
How's that a picture of Jesus too?
Yeah, that's so good. And we talked about Jacob's ladder. Another thing is the angel of the Lord. You'll see that. You'll see in Scripture a angel of the Lord, and then you'll also see the angel of the Lord, which some people say is that a theophany. I ripped what I'm about to read from the Gospel Transformation Bible. I thought it was helpful. So obviously there are other opinions on this, but I thought this is good. It says the angel of the Lord frequently appears in the Old Testament as the Lord's messenger, a distinct being who is yet so identified with Yahweh that to see him is to see God. In Exodus, the angel is identified with the pillar of cloud and fire and the means of God leading Israel to the promised land. While many identify the angel's appearances in the Old Testament as those of the pre-incarnate Son of God, and I have lots of friends that have that opinion, where the angel of the Lord appears after Jesus has already been conceived. So it says, while we identify the angel appearance in the Old Testament as those of the pre-incarnate Son, we see in Matthew 1:20, 1:24, 2:13, 2:19, in those instances we see the angel of the Lord appearing after Jesus has already been born. So it can at least be said that he serves to foreshadow the way that Jesus reveals God to his people as one sent from him, yet identified with God. So like at a bare minimum, the angel of the Lord is foreshadowing to us how God reveals himself. So maybe it's Jesus, maybe it's just foreshadowing, but that's an interesting thing. We talked about Tamar.
Yep. And Joseph, what
about you? What do you think some interesting things about Joseph? I thought it was interesting that he's 30
years old. There's a connection there.
Yeah.
He goes to Egypt, which Jesus also, goes to Egypt. And he's going to prefigure, Israel and the entire nation in doing that as well.
Yeah.
What else?
He saves the people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He sits at the right hand of the king. Anything else?
I think that his humble origins and then being promoted also would prefigure.
He was betrayed for money.
Yeah. So tons of parallels.
Yeah, lots of parallels there. Yeah, that's great. Well, going into next week, most of you should be through chapter 44 in Genesis. So you're going to finish up Joseph's story, and then you're going to get into Exodus. So we want to just wrap up by setting up Exodus. So real quick, I'm going to turn over to Bill, but in chapter 1, Genesis, there's this cultural mandate given, and God blesses Adam and Eve and tells them to be fruitful and to do what?
Multiply.
Multiple times, God tells Abraham that he's going to have a nation that's as many as the stars in the sky.
I love that.
Right? And then at the very beginning of Exodus, in chapter 1, verse 7, what does it say? He's like they were multiplied.
Yeah, they were fruitful and increased greatly.
Yeah, so 70 people show up from Jacob's family to Egypt. They start to become a nation within a nation, and now we're
400 years later, and they number how many? Maybe 500,000 people.
Who knows? I don't know.
People have tried to calculate it, but
but Genesis 15:7 told us that they had to spend 400 years in this land before God would rescue them. And then, so how does God rescue them? What do we need to look for? You got an alliteration for us?
Yes. So as you look through Exodus, there's 3 big ideas that you want to look for, and we did come up with alliteration for it because that's just how we roll. I did.
You nailed it. English teacher.
But first, look for it's about His promise. We talked about it starting in Genesis. He's going to multiply them. He's going to bless the earth. His promise that he made to Abraham. And so look for his promise in his deliverance as you're going to read about Passover and how they passed through the Red Sea. And you're going to see how God keeps his promise. So that's the first part. Number 2, look for his presence. This is so huge that God, he was with them in the Garden of Eden, and you see this thing, he wants to be with his people. And so he's going to talk to them, and he's going to say, here's how to build this tabernacle. I'm going to be among you.
Yeah, and we talked about the with us, God being with you is not just his omnipresence. It's something, it's this powerful active force of saving. Like it's God's active presence, not just a general presence.
Yeah, and specifically, and that's as you read about and think about God's presence within you through the Holy Spirit. That this is part of that history of God's presence with His people. And then the last thing, 3 P's here. So we've got promise, presence, and then His precepts. He gives them His law, which can have a harsh sound initially in your mind, but it really is He's showing them how to live and how to flourish. That's what it's all about. And so we get the 10 Commandments, and then we get some additional laws and instruction along with that. And so those are the three big things that you're going to look for in Exodus. And right at the start, though, in those first 15 chapters, as you'll see the call of Moses. Wow. You'll see the deliverance through the plagues, and then passing through the Red Sea. And then 15 ends with this song.
Yeah, the Song of Moses or the Song of the Sea.
Yes,
the first praise song.
Yeah, and it's
Bible.
awesome. I mean, because God delivered them, and they lifted up their voices and shouted. And even if you fast forward in Revelation, it says at that time they sing the Song of Moses and the Song of the Lamb. So it's this incredible moment. If you haven't seen the Prince of Egypt movie, you could watch that. Maybe show that to your kids, because it's got those moments in there, powerful. With this narrative.
That's great. Yeah. So we have God hearing his people crying out like, we're enslaved. This isn't right. Yeah. We have God speaking to Moses, right? Mm-hmm. Calling him to be the deliverer of the people. Mm-hmm. We have God redeeming the people through the plague. So here's something interesting. As you're reading this, you're going to see this hardened heart of Pharaoh. And chances are you're thinking, I wonder what Bill and Jeff are going to say next week. I want to challenge you to dive into that on your own. Take a little personal dive and see if you can't figure out some different takes on what's going on there. I'd love to challenge you in that. And then after they are redeemed, like I said, you get the song of Moses as they escape, and then God's about to lead them through the wilderness, and so he's leading them to Mount Sinai, and then he's going to instruct them. And so. So I'd say the first half of Exodus probably goes all the way to chapter 18. Mm-hmm. So you get to 15, the song ends, and then in 16 to 18, just things take a bad turn. Yeah. They're on their way to Mount Sinai. They're like, God's leading them, feeding them, and they're like, we'd rather go back to Egypt, and things go sideways. But that's Exodus. We're going to get into. Mm-hmm. So we look forward to wrestling with some of those questions. Do your own diving and digging, but we're looking forward to continuing Shadows of Jesus next week.
See you then.
Yeah, see you then.